Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Andrew Stratelites and Logos. This is our third installment of Discussions with Plato, and we are talking about the Credo. So one thing I want to do is have a sort of a abstracted resolution discussion of it. The Credo can be roughly divided into three contexts. One is the arguments made by Credo to Socrates to spring him out of jail. Then Socrates gives a generic response about justice and why you shouldn't do that. And then he just breaks down each of the individual arguments that Credo makes. One thing that I just realized is very, very interesting. That is exactly the same format that Thomas Aquinas uses in the Summa Theologica with objections, on the contrary, and I answer, which presumably he's copying Socrates in this regard. Let's just start with that, the breakdown of the Credo. So Andrew, what are your thoughts on the broad format of it?
Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting point, right? That we see these echoed in the Western tradition later in like Thomas Aquinas, and I think that this is sort of one of the Platonic dialogues which seems the most similar to the Memorabilia from Xenophon, where in some sense Socrates is just being very straightforward on like explaining something about virtue and the circumstance, and Credo is sort of taking, I call it sort of the common sense or naive approach to start with, and then is slowly convinced by Socrates that he's correct. And I think that is sort of the key thing here, right? Is that Crito is not a sophist or an opponent, but he's a friend who might not just be as wise as Socrates or as virtuous, and sort of has conventional beliefs about what's good and evil, right? That it's better not to be executed than to be executed. And he's worried about losing some of his reputation and all this other stuff.
All right, Logos, any thoughts on at this level?
Yeah, I mean, look at the broad form of the dialogue. It definitely takes the form of what you were pointing out. Something I want to note too is in the broad way in which the dialogue goes. There's actually a broad contour where in the first part he starts off by investigating basically your moral relationship to the many. And then in the middle part that you're talking about, he talks about like his moral relationship to the self. And in the final part, he talks about his moral relationship to the state. And it's really, really interesting how there's that format that you brought up, but he doesn't keep the same kind of dynamics of the conversation constant throughout the three phases of the Credo.
Right. Now, what's interesting, if we look at Credo's 4 objections, his first one is, look, Socrates, if we don't spring you from prison, people aren't going to believe us if we tell you that you said you wanted to die in prison. They're going to say, oh, how could you be Socrates' friend? If you were Socrates' friend, you would have sprung him from prison. And, he said, well, we can't live that down. We're not going to be seen, we don't want to be seen as cowards or as false friends. We see that in number 2, the second objection, don't constrain yourself about any price we might pay, whether it's a financial price or their own lives. He says, we're in this together. There's price is no object. And then he says, justice demands doing good to one's friends and harm to one's enemies. And then he says, in the 4th objection, it's his duty as a father to survive and educate his children. Now, what's interesting is, on the one hand, a lot of this is what we might call conventional morality of the classical age. And in fact, while in I think Book 1 of the Republic, Plato says, well, doing justice is not giving someone one's due, which seems to be what Credo is saying. It's giving someone one's due is what justice is. Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics, then defines justice as giving someone their due. So it does seem that there is this background assumption of justice that even an Aristotle would defend, that Socrates and Plato are contesting. And we also see a very interesting counterpoint with Christ's teachings in the New Testament. He says in the Sermon on the Mount, "You've heard it said, and hate, love your friends and hate your enemies," and which is exactly what Credo says. So it's a convention that transcends the Mediterranean. Both Greeks and Hebrews have this convention, and like we'll see with Socrates a little bit later, Jesus says that's wrong. You should not harm your enemies. And we see that there is this underlying conventional morality that we have with the Greeks and the Hebrews, which I think nicely correlates with Kierkegaard's idea of the moral man, the second in his, whereas Socrates and Jesus are really pointing to the godly man, right? So Kierkegaard has three views. There's the aesthetic man who loves beauty in a rather sort of aristocratic, devouring sense, and then there's the moral man who stands on principles, and then there's the third and highest man, the godly man, who can then transcend the limits of the moral. So we could argue that Credo is at the second level, and Socrates, if not at the third, is pointing to the third level. So, Andrew, what are some of your thoughts on Crito's 4 objections?
Yeah, and I think that this is sort of halfway between the Stoic and Aristotelian way of looking at it. That there are, and I'll go ahead and use the Stoic language first, right? That there is good and evil, which is like moral in character, and then there are like preferred and dispreferred circumstances, and that basically the key thing is that we must always sacrifice a preferred circumstance for a moral good. Or in Aristotelian language, you always have to sacrifice a lower good for a higher good. And I think that this is sort of one of the critiques in the classical world, is that people confuse and misorder things so that they put natural goods over spiritual goods, basically, right? And in some sense, Credo is right that those are 4 important things, but Socrates comes back and talks about these things that are even more important than them, that you have to be willing to sacrifice them for that higher thing.
Yes, Logos.
Yeah, as I said in my opening, I think the 4 criticisms, insofar as they line up with how neatly the dialogue is divided into parts, I think they exemplify certain things. So the first criticism, when Credo says, well, what will all the other people think about me? If Socrates wanted to be really cheeky, he would have said, well, what position did all the people get me into in the first place, Credo? Why do you care what they think? He was a little bit more polite than that, but that would have been like really on the nose and hilarious if Socrates had said that. Now, that objection and the whole conversation surrounding it, I take actually to be kind of like an implicit discussion on morality of the mob, morality of the masses. In the same way, the quote, the part of it that sticks out to me most is when Socrates says, I love this, I only wish, Credo, that they, the masses, could, for then they could also do the greatest good, and that would be well. But the truth is, they can do neither good nor evil. They cannot make a man wise or make him foolish, and whatever they do is a result of chance, right? Like that's amazing. So what he's saying is, if you tie what's moral to how the crowd perceives you, there will never be a balancing point, which echoes very, very common criticisms we see today of relative morality relative to popular opinion and things like that, because you can be loved in the spotlight one day and then just absolutely hated the next. Look at Twitter social mobs, man. Celebrity darlings say the wrong thing once and everybody just like hates them instantly. So that's like the first commentary. The second commentary, when he's talking about not harming your enemies, basically I think that was in the part of the conversation where he's talking about the self and doing what is right. So before then, so that transition in the conversation about, well, if you don't listen to the mob, maybe you listen to the wise man. But then Credo objects, and that moves the conversation from listening to a wise man to listening to yourself. If you know what's right, you do it even if somebody else has hurt you, basically is the point of that. But I think that part of the conversation, again, was a shell to investigate the morality of the self, Bouye ethics, or just like self-subjective ethics, like I have my own internal moral chronometer, I should follow it. Are there problems with that? And yes, at a meta level, there are problems with that. So when Socrates notes that I should listen to myself and do what's right, contrast that with what he said earlier about the man not listening to the wise man, say the gymnast not listening to his teacher. Now, what if a man is getting the advice of a wise man, and the wise man's telling the man something he knows to be wrong or something, or he doesn't think is quite correct? Well, is the man supposed to listen to himself or listen to the wise man? And so all of these criticisms of Credo are interesting in their own, but I again think they're conversation pieces for Socrates to look at these very meta issues about ethics.
Yes. Now, if we look at the sort of centerpiece, though, of Socrates' argument, it's what is justice, right? Because it's important in the third argument that Credo gives. He's making an appeal to justice. And Socrates is saying, well, no, your understanding of justice is incorrect. So before he directly critiques that view of justice, he then defines his own view. And what's interesting here is this is what we might call one of the first examples of a steel man, where Socrates is giving his best argument from the point of view of the Athenians, which, again, just goes to show how relevant in modern these dialogues feel. It feels like this is a kind of conversation that happens all the time on the internet right now. But it's really a tripartite argument based on the city. The first two arguments are that he was born in the city and raised in the city, so it's the city as mother and father. Mother because she gave birth to him, father because it raised him, and therefore it's a filial duty to the city, analogous to the duty you would have to a mother and a father. But then the third part is really interesting, because here he makes a sort of social contractarian argument saying, well, look, I implicitly consented to live within the city, therefore I implicitly agreed to its laws. And we'll see that argument made explicitly by Locke in his political teachings. And so we see here that Socrates is giving us Plato is giving us one of the earliest examples of a social contract. But what Socrates is saying, though, is that if we view, and then he says, well, I would be doing bad to the city. The city did all this good for me. It gave birth to me. It raised me. And if I disobey its laws, which I've consented to, then I'm doing it harm. Because he says in this middle portion, one ought not to do harm even to one's enemies. And this is where it sounds extremely Christian and Christ-like. Yeah, you compare that in the Credo to Matthew chapter 5, and it's really a stunning comparison that you would even have this. And we see that this is one of the enduring qualities of Socrates and why he is a favorite of Christian philosophers and thinkers down the ages. So, Andrew, what are your thoughts on this middle portion?
Yeah, I tend to agree that is sort of the key thing, and where things are starting to sort of blossom into this natural theology that is very commiserate, not only with things we see from the Hebrews, but in Christ himself, right? And this is, I think, the real point of resonance that we start to see between classical thought and Christianity.
Okay, a logo.
Yeah. On the conversation of the city specifically, this is where the dialogue started to get really, really interesting to me, because it seems here, given what Socrates said in the past, it sounds like Plato is setting up a puzzle for the reader to solve. So what got Socrates into this position was the Athenian court. So Socrates says, don't listen to like the will of the group of people. Don't worry about the group of people. But now here Socrates is saying, well, I have an obligation to the city. So Socrates must mean something else by the city relative to the plurality of its inhabitants. Because if he just means the plurality of its inhabitants, then everything he's saying here completely contradicts everything he said in the beginning, because he already said he has no moral obligation to listen to the masses. So what must he mean by the city? Well, he can't just mean the geography, because I think even Socrates would know that geographic regions can come and go, be conquered or not. Like, consider Athens under the rule of Sparta versus not under the rule of Sparta, for example, right? Was the suppose Athens gets conquered by Sparta in Socrates' lifetime, and I'm terrible at history. Todd was talking about the tyrannical rule in the previous stream, but suppose Socrates is in Athens and Spartans capture Athens, and Socrates still feels loyal to Athens to stay, but under the Spartans, Socrates gets sentenced to death or something. Well, if the Spartans sacrifice, if it's Spartan Athens that sentences Socrates to death, is that Athens the same Athens that raises Socrates? And we'll see echoes of this, I think, in the Ship of Theseus problem down the road. But that's a puzzle. So the city can't be the plurality of the people. And I don't think he can plausibly think that it's just the geographic region, the buildings and the things like that, because those are headed by governments that can do tyrannical or, just or unjust things. And so this is the biggest puzzle for me when he starts transitioning to defending the state in this way is I don't see how he can defend the state in this very boisterous manner that he does in light of how he opened the dialogue. So that's my riddle.
Well, one thing I want to say to you, Logos, and then give you a chance to respond is I think by his treating of the city as mother and father, we can argue implicitly that he agrees with Aristotle, where Aristotle defines in the Politics that the city, the polis, is an extension of the family. So what makes a polis different than a family or a kinship group is that whereas a kinship group has a certain kind of relationship, that a relationship is underlined by blood, whereas the polis seeks to project that same kind of communal relationship, but transcend mere blood ties. And so it's a higher order level of an idea that is expressed in the family. And I think that what Plato is saying by appealing in that middle argument is that's his view of the state. And it's really an extension of filial piety. So what is being obeyed and what is being objected to is not the constituent parts per se, but the sum, which is mother and father.
I mean, I kind of get where that's coming from. But then at the same time, like he has to realize that in the abstract, that's all well and good. And you shouldn't seek to do harm to the city if you can help it. But at the same time, what the laws are and what the punishments aren't given out by the family in the abstract, these abstract familial ties. They are given out by, sentenced by, written by, voted on by, and so on, groups of people that Socrates has come right out of the gate saying they don't act for good or for evil. Whatever they do, they just do by chance. And so tying these two together, basically Socrates is just saying, declare yourself to this familial authority and just follow the wave of chance for whatever moral machinations that come, I guess.
Andrew, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that, and maybe this is an incorrect intuition on my part, but I think that part of what he is sort of articulating is a loyalty to things that tend toward to be more transcendent, right? So there's the familial bond, right, between parents and child, and that's one level of transcendence. But then there's the city, right, which will persist even across generations. And I think that he's articulating something even more transcendent, and is sort of talking about this greater loyalty to things that as they become more and more transcendent. Or at least that's one of the flavors that I get.
Okay. Now, the Socrates' rebuttals of Crito's arguments. The first one I like. Who cares what the masses think? The masses don't have anything worth saying. But he says we should listen to the good man, and it's really the good man that we ought to listen to because it's his opinions that matter, not those of the multitude. Socrates argues with regards to the second that if he did as Crito wished, they would risk losing much money and possibly their lives, which would be injuring them, which would be injustice to them, which he will not do. He argues, again, elaborates a little bit more on the idea that you should not do injustice to someone else, i.e. the city, even to one's enemies. So therefore it would be injustice to disobey the city's laws that he consented to live under for all these years. And then fourthly, he says that if he, for the sake of the children, he said, well, look, if I violate my principles now at the point of death, that would be a worse example for my children than me dying. So the hardship of me, Socrates, dying and then being bereft, but having my example as a martyr to the truth would be better than me living and then forfeiting the truth, because they would lose something more by me forfeiting the truth. He mentions that they'd be vagabonds traveling from city to city, not having anywhere to go, getting a subpar education, and losing faith in their father. Now, yeah, okay. So, what do you think about these objections, Andrew?
Yeah. I apologize. I'm not sure I'm able to comment on that right now.
Okay. Logos.
So, yeah, I think these objections are a little bit better than the other ones because they're more pragmatic. What will my children do when I die, and other considerations. Now, one thing that these objections, along with the previous ones together, make me think about is something like this, especially the question of like not doing harm to one's enemies, or even one's enemies, but certainly not doing harm to the city. Now, previous in the dialogue, Socrates mentioned the wise man counseling him, and Socrates also mentioned him listening to himself and doing what he thinks to be right. Now, what if he honestly thought, or a wise man told him, whether the wise man was his spirit, like we talked about privately, or some other wise man that Socrates took to be wise? What if that entity told Socrates that what the Athenians were doing was going to cause great harm to the city? Now, Socrates answers this in a sense: no matter what harm is being done, don't inflict more harm. But it does bring up an interesting question. Like, if so much harm was going to be done that it would actually destroy the city, is there a point at which Socrates could do a little bit of harm to mitigate greater harm? So Andrew brought up a good point when talking about sacrificing lower goods for higher goods. You can flip that question on its head and ask, is it worth committing lower harms to stop higher harms? And the obvious example of this would be like putting somebody in jail if they commit a crime. Well, imprisoning them is certainly doing harm to them. If a murderer or robber or whoever victimizes someone, you catch them, you put them in jail, you're literally kidnapping them. You're doing harm to their person. But in doing harm to their person, you're basically taking them off the streets to make them not a danger to other people. So you're inflicting a lower harm on that person to stop an aggregate higher harm that their existence would continue to commit on society. Now, one thing I worry about with the tact Socrates takes here is the nuance is lost. And so you don't have this discussion about, well, could I harm Athens a little to save it from a greater harm that's being inflicted? Now, in Socrates' case, he's old, he's 70, nothing he could do. But the interesting question is, suppose Socrates was 30, or, something like that. He had a lot of years left of his life, and he could do a lot of political activism to change some fundamental problem that Athens had. Now, if that was the case, I mean, is there an argument that Socrates could be made that mitigating the greater harm would be worth it? I mean, if the answer is no, it seems to me that that's a big problem. But if the answer is yes, we're going to have to figure out how to score the dialogue.
Yeah, and this also gets to, what is harm too, right? So it's not just do you sacrifice a lesser good for a greater good, what is even harm? Because is it if you were unjustly accused of a crime and sentenced to death, and then you escaped, um, are you doing harm to the ones that did that to you? Because I think there's room to argue that you're not. Now, there might be other reasons why you would want to suffer the penalty. Maybe as a moral example, that seems to be Socrates' motivation here, that of a moral example. But he doesn't really, explain. Well, he gives us his understanding of it. And one slight defect of the dialogues is that they do feel somewhat contrived in the sense that Socrates either always convinces his interlocutor or has the last word and makes them look stupid. So, if we had a more realistic discussion of people arguing, it might not come out looking that simply. But Andrew, what are some of your thoughts?
Well, usually, and I think this is getting at the heart of the matter, is that harm is things that impede or destroy the telos of the thing, right? And so one of the most elaborate examples is, or nuanced examples is, let's imagine a man, right? And he runs into a burning building to save a child, right? It can be his child or it can just be an innocent child, right? And in the process of fulfilling this duty, he's badly burned and loses his arm. So the question is, in some sense, right, he has been harmed by this action. But in another sense, he hasn't. He's actually been able to show the fruition of his telos as a hero, while these other things were destroyed. And this is part of what Socrates, I think, is getting at, right, is that in some sense, if he were to escape his imprisonment and execution, it would be sort of like treating cancer by killing the patient, right? That would eliminate the injustice, but it would eliminate the teleology of the state itself, right? And that I think that's how I look at his argument. That this is sort of the thing of the essences of these things, and the thing that he has to do is he has to be in accord with these higher values that are going on.
All right, Logos.
Another thing to kind of respin what I was talking about in terms of what Andrew just said. Here's something I was thinking of. Let me pretend to be the wise man speaking sweet nothings into Socrates' ear for a second. And I tell Socrates, well, you've already admitted, buddy, that the mob can be fickle, and they can put innocent men to justice, or put innocent man to death for speaking the truth. Well, Socrates, you've already admitted earlier in the dialogue that not allowing justice to be done, right? Covering justice up within justice can do harm to a thing in itself, just as a fatal illness can do harm to the body. Now, what if I was to tell Socrates that Socrates, allowing these people to do this to you sets the precedent? They could keep doing it again. What you've just told them is it's perfectly fine for them to get away with suppressing justice, righteousness, and truth by putting innocent men to death. Now, if Socrates is right, and we can think of the state kind of like a body that one does injury to, and he's already admitted that justice kind of forcing a body to live unjustly is almost as if doing harm to the body in the abstract, that if you were to let the Athenian court get away with this precedent that they could repeat over and over and over again, that would be akin to forcing some kind of fundamental harm on the state. And so at the higher level that Andrew's talking about, I think this is really, really important, that I think this has to be weighed. It's not just about Socrates accepting the verdict of his trial to uphold the sanctity of the law. I think one thing that's really missing from this dialogue, which would have really aided it greatly, was the discussion of precedent. If they got rid of doing this once to one innocent man, they could do it to many others. And that's why in one of the fundamental pillars of our legal system now is better to let 100 guilty men go free than to let even one innocent man, rot in jail or be killed by the state or whatever your example is. And part of that is because if you can get away with killing this innocent man, you could get away with killing the next one. You could get away with killing the next one. And soon enough, you could get away with it in some systematic way that could really do harm to the institution of justice, which leads to kind of like the other broader point. It's not just that these evil men could get away with perpetually committing evil on Athens. Another interesting question, too, which really speaks to current events, is suppose that there are a bunch of Athenians who lose faith in the justice system because they see an innocent man convicted and put to death by the state. As Socrates said in his own closing, the justice system works because people have faith in it. So on the one hand, you can't have people just skirting their rulings in the state, letting them get away with it. That'll make the state look feckless. On the other hand, you can't allow the state go around giving unjust and terrible rulings and killing innocent people, because people look at the trials like kangaroo courts, and they'll lose faith in the system that way. And of course, I'm referring recently to the Kyle Rittenhouse case, of course, and how people are watching that ruling on both sides. People on both sides, regardless of the merits of whatever you think their arguments were, questioned whether the ruling will be a legitimate and just one. The left, if he gets off, didn't like that very much. The right, if he gets convicted, will be an unjust ruling that will punish people for defending themselves everywhere. The precedent will be felt for miles. So regardless, the ruling of the case, the precedent it sets, determines people's faith in the court system as such. Like, I personally know people who have told me, like, hey, if Rittenhouse gets convicted, the law is a farce. I consider the police mortal and military enemies that wish to do harm to me, because they don't let me defend my own person. They will seek to persecute me. They will give me the Rittenhouse treatment, put me in jail. Forget the system of justice. Its sanctity is gone. They're basically an occupying military force I will treat as a threat. And that is definitely a consideration I think Socrates should look at.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point there, Logos. The idea that, on the one hand, Socrates, there's like a dilemma that he's not actually aware of. So on the one hand, we see his argument against disobeying the state, because that would set the bad precedent of undermining the authority of the state. But if the state undermines its own credibility by unjust actions, and you go along with it, then you haven't actually avoided the pitfall that you're trying to avoid. Yeah, Andrew, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, and I apologize because this made a really abstract connection to me, is that I think it's possibly in Poland or some other Eastern European country, and they have a special like Medal of Honor that's given in military circumstances, specifically for people that have acted with valor contrary to rules. And I think that that's one of the key things that we're sort of touching on, right? Is that in an imperfect system, how does it correct for its own imperfections, right? And so the sort of American solution is bottom up, that if the state is corrupt, we just arm ourselves and become somewhat sovereign ourselves to fight against it, right? Or that we act as a power balance against the state. And then what Socrates might be doing, based on sort of the historical context and actually what happened afterwards, is actually shaming the state by having them execute an innocent man and requiring them to reform in order to handle that. And that's sort of an interesting thing, right? Is that Socrates obviously wasn't naive, right? He's not just someone who's being a fool and just, I'm going to do the right thing no matter what. He's thinking about these things really, really hard. And so that's sort of a very interesting question, right? Is that as a martyr to the error of the system, is that more effective at having the system reform and repent, or is it better to punish the system more directly?
Yes. And one of the things that is interesting, we could analyze these objections and these arguments based on the contingent historical realities that were being expressed, and do we think that they're good arguments or bad arguments on those grounds? But we can also judge them in a more abstract sense, even if we extract them out of the contingent historical context in which they were given. We can say, well, is this better or not? Because to be honest, if I'm talking about what I think are the convincing arguments and the ones that are I don't find convincing, when Socrates rebuts Credo, I do find his first objection compelling. They'll listen to the crowd. They're listen to the wise man, listen to the teacher. The idea about harm and injustice, while I agree with in principle, I don't know if this is an applicable case, as we've already mentioned. I also think that his argument about the children seems to me weak, because I think that it would be, unless you had a really good reason, and I don't think this is actually a good enough reason. So, for example, if you were a Christian martyr and the people that were trying to kill you were saying, well, look, think of your children, don't hold true to Christ. Well, I'd say hold true to Christ. Losing your children, or your children losing their father, it would be better for them under those circumstances. But I don't, or in the case of a classical morality, defending your country from an invader, father dies in the war, which is bad for the children, but it's better because their freedom is maintained. And that's probably closer. Well, and Socrates is, I think, somewhere in the middle between those two analogies. But I don't think it's quite as compelling a case as he thinks. That's my first blush view of his 4 counter arguments to Credo. Andrew, how convincing or compelling do you find these 4 objections to Credo?
I'm going to give a pretty strange answer. I think there are strong objections to Credo, but I don't think there's strong universal grounds, because I think they're all contextual to the specific case, and that if you try to apply them sort of naively, you're going to end up with something like state worship, right? Where anything that the state does is acceptable because the state is bigger than you or more eternal than you, which isn't the case, right? And we know where this goes down with the various ideologically based states of the 20th century. And so that's my critique, right? That I think they're compelling arguments, but you actually even have to push it further to come up with a universal system.
Yeah, okay, same question to you, Logos.
Yeah, so I think the objections Socrates makes and the arguments set up around the objections are ultimately leading in a circle. So like imagine that the dialogue kind of wraps around again, right? So we first start with, well, what do the people think? And Socrates says, well, the people are idiots. Don't listen to the people. Okay, well, who do you listen to? We listen to wise people. Okay, well, what if the wise people is telling you to do something that's not good? Well, you know what the right thing to do is. Listen to yourself. Oh, well, Socrates, you have pretty good reason to run away. You know the state's harming you. You've told me. You know it's wrong. That's what's being done to you. So why isn't that good enough? Well, because the state's a bigger idea, right? You can't let everybody default to whatever they want. Think of the state. Everything will break down. All the institutions will break down. Oh, okay, Socrates, but if the state does this, right? If the state punishes you unjustly, think of the precedent. What will the people think about their legal systems? Wrap around back to dialogue. Well, don't listen to the people and what they think about the legal systems. The people are stupid. Well, okay, Socrates, if we don't listen to the people, what do? And around we go. I think the entire point of the dialogue at a meta, very clever level is just to set up the circle. All the arguments Socrates makes kind of feed it in the next level of the circle. And ultimately, Socrates just says, meh, I'm just going to have to do nothing and see what happens, is ultimately what I take. It's kind of like a resignation for Socrates, where he looks at the absurdity of it all and just says, yeah, you're right. No matter which way I choose to try to justify what I do, it's best I just do nothing in all the circumstances. But the circle itself is the interesting question.
Yeah. I think we've actually covered most of the topics here. Is there anything else you'd like to bring up, Andrew?
Nothing comes to mind.
You, Logos?
Let me think just a second. Let me check my notes. I actually took some good notes on this one.
You did take some good notes on this one. One thing that's interesting is while you're looking at your notes, Logos, I think an interesting way to sort of contextualize the three elements in the Credo. The idea of the people, i.e., those popular representatives within the government. And since this is all this part of the trial dialogues, we can also refer back to the Apology, where the poets are writing all of these, canards like Aristophanes, the clouds against Socrates, Crito himself, and then Socrates. And I really do think that these three groups fit very nicely into the moral matrix of Kierkegaard. The aesthetic man cares only about novelty and pleasure, but he does believe pleasure is a good, but it's just for the sake of pleasure. And you have the poets and the aristocracy. These are rather frivolous people, as we see within the dialogues. Credo is the ethical man. He believes that we have to relate to others, principally and orderly, and not, undercut, civil society. And then Socrates is the religious man who points to the higher moral good that we ought to aim at, which by aiming at it, it might look like we're violating some more mundane social arrangement that the ethical man finds very valuable. And it's not that the ethical man is in some sense bad, it's just that he's incomplete. And even the aesthetic man piece somewhere between bad and incomplete, because he does see a concept of the good. It's just a very watered down view. And to what extent, I wonder how much this dialogue and the three component parts influence Kierkegaard in this. But Logos, anything in your notes?
Yeah, there's one thing that I found nestled away in my notes that I wanted to talk about. I'm glad I found it. So we've been focusing a lot about the tensions that Socrates raises with his various own positions in his dialogue. But if you look at like an interdialogue tension as well, apply Socrates as wise man and apply the state to the Euthyphro and the Euthyphro dilemma, right? So Socrates says, well, listen to the wise man. Well, Socrates from the Euthyphro could ask, well, what makes the wise man wise, Socrates? Is the wise man wise because Socrates listens to him? Or does Socrates listen to a man because he's wise? It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of saying, like, hey, the same Euthyphro-esque problems could amount to you finding a wise man to listen to anyway. Are you going to find the wise man that'll tell you the sweet nothings you would like to hear anyway? Or is there some other objective quality that you have for finding the wise man? And if so, what's that? Well, if you know what those qualities are in the wise man, then you'd probably be wise, at least as wise as the wise man himself, to know such qualities. Is an interesting inference you could take from that. The other thing too is the state, right? Is what the state does good? Well, I haven't thought this one all the way through, but there's another Euthyphro-esque problem you could set up with the state. You wouldn't have to set one up with the masses, because Socrates never says to listen to the masses in any part of the dialogue. So, but for the other parts, he does say to listen to the wise man, the self, and the state. Not only is there tension within the dialogue in a circle with how those things conflict with each other, but looking at his other dialogues, namely Euthyphro, there's a Euthyphro-esque dilemma that could be applied to each of the individual parts, compounding the trouble.
Yeah. Andrew, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that part of this is sort of the approach that the academic skeptics ended up taking, right? That these questions, if you crank them up all the way, you end up getting into these extreme bootstrap problems, where the amount of uncertainty you have is so high that all you can do is maybe like make probabilistic statements or things like that, right? And I guess I'm starting to understand why they said nothing is certain except this, right? That nothing is certain. And that the other thing that we have to look at with that, right, and sort of the way out of these bootstrap problems is the power of nous or noetic seeing, that in addition to logic and like verbal reasoning, we have the ability to see truths as well, right? And this is part of sort of the Cynic Stoic thing from Socrates is that you can see virtues in people. That's a lot easier to detect than how reasoned their arguments are in some sense. Or maybe not easier to detect, but a much better indicator of them having phronosis and wisdom. And this doesn't touch into that, right? Because, or actually it does, right? Because the sort of moral exemplar look at Socrates is like, yes, he faced death for his alliance or love of the truth, right? Even though he might have been wrong about these truths, down to even being like wrong for the reasons that he stated, his loyalty was such that he was willing to die for it, right? And maybe that's an additional layer. That's the point here of what it means to be loyal to the truth as far as you understand it.
Logos, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think at this point I've set basically everything up I want to talk about. The cool circle about how things fight with each other, the way things fight with themselves, with the Euthyphro considerations. I guess my final word would just be, I look forward to seeing if there's any echo effects from this dialogue that will carry forth into the other ones, like say the Laws of the Republic, in the same way that the Shadows of Euthyphro kind of carried over into this one. To see if you can use previous dialogues to critique other ones. Maybe what Plato said before still stands and he missed something, or maybe Plato changed his mind on something. Who knows? But I think those are interesting things to carry forward to future discussions.
Yeah, definitely. Andrew, final thoughts.
Sorry, equipment here is moving. Yeah, I think that this sort of shows the multiple layers of both like the Socratic discussion that we talked about, and the engagement with these moral dilemmas, and how Socrates and Plato look at abstractions, and even like how moral action and like philosophical honesty touch each other in these things. So I think that we've touched on a lot of it, and yeah, I'm really excited to continue down it.
I as well. I will end with a brief quoting comparison of the Credo about injury and then the Sermon on the Mount where Christ mentions it. Socrates, nor when injured, injure in return, as the many imagine, for we must injure no one at all. Credo, certainly not. Socrates, again Credo, maybe do evil. Credo, certainly not Socrates. Socrates, and what of doing evil in return for evil? What is the morality of the many? Is the just or not? Credo, not just. Socrates, for doing evil to another is the same as injuring him. Credo, very true. And then Matthew 5:43 to 48. You have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and the unjust. For if ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans do the same? And if yet ye salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Do not even the publicans so? Be ye perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. Thanks again, Andrew and Logos. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.